Welcome to Eviliv3, Live Media Commentary Show that answers the question, how long do you have to train to be a samurai? Subscribe if you're new to the channel because today we are reviewing the novel Shōgun. My initial thoughts are, sweet hell, this was an insane, it's like 1,300 pages, very, very in-depth into Japanese culture, of which I'm not entirely sure all of it is actually accurate, and wildly sexual, infinitely more than I ever would have suspected it to be, but really entertaining. And the only reason why I went to look to look to read this novel is because the series was amazing. I'll be reviewing the series next, but I mean, I can't the scope of everything just sort of blew me away. And so it took me weeks to get the audiobook from the library. I could have bought it, but it was available free. I just had to wait a little bit, a lot of it. And so I ended up picking up the audiobook, realizing how long of a book it actually was. And it just took me a long time to get through because of the sheer scope. I think with that in mind, I have to do a little compare and contrast between the book and the series, but I'm going to keep it bare minimum. And let's just give you some details about this book first. So it was written by James Clavell. It was published by the UK, in the UK by Hodder and Stoughton in 1975, and in the US the same year as by Delacorte Press. And Clavell, the author, was an officer in the Royal Artillery during World War II. He was a prisoner of war at Changi Prison in Singapore from 1942 to 1945, an experience that formed the basis of his first novel, King Rat. Despite this experience, he admired Japan and the Japanese people and described Shōgun as passionately pro-Japanese. And after having read it and watched the series, I agree, it is pro-Japanese. The irony is that my family and I went over to Tokyo after like half of the series was released. And so we had this wonderful primer of what sort of Tokyo was going to be like through the historical lens of the series. And then we actually get there, and of course it's modern day and everything. So, but we like walked the grounds of the Emperor's Palace, and like everything that the series is about led up to the era that existed prior to Tokyo being the new capital, and seeing that historical museums and fortresses and just the land and the people and everything, it was stunning. It was just a wonderful experience that, without having seen the series, would have still been just as amazing and wonderful. After having seen the series, it added context and richness to our trip. And that's really why I wanted to read it, because I was wondering how much, anytime you get a novel to film adaptation, you're losing a lot. And necessarily, you have to lose some because, one, inner dialogue doesn't work. You can have some monologuing going on or voiceover work, but that gets tiresome. And you want to show, not tell, when you're presenting a film or a series. And so I knew that there would be infinite amount of content lost in translation from novel to series. And sweet hell was there ever. But the baseline story is pretty amazing and in depth as well, because ultimately when you learn about Japanese culture, it's so wildly different than Western cultures that, I mean, not only are you seeing it through the character Blackthorne's eyes, which is incredibly important because he's our sort of in to the culture, as it were, but you're also realizing that there are some concepts that are baffling that have actually held back Japanese culture. And they've been like in this stasis, or they had been in this stasis for thousands of years, whereas the rest of the Western world was advancing technologically and industrially. Japan never did that until Western culture came in and started fighting over who should be the dominant influence in Japan and who should be the one leading them out of their very sort of traditional and I'm going to use the word medieval, even though that's not really true. Dynastic ways is probably more accurate. And that's really at the core of what this novel is all about, is Westerners coming over between Portuguese Catholics and British Protestants. Those are the two religious groups. And Japanese culture only recognizes them as Christian, which they are, but they are Christian only in the fact that they come from the same sort of core founding document. And other than that, they war with each other for years and years and years. So Protestants and Catholics, while they are, yes, both Christian, they are very different denominations and have very different ideas. And to see that explored through the lens of Japanese culture was something I never experienced before. And, because clearly I'm not. And it was very fascinating for me to just isolate the religious aspect and the absurdity of the divide between these two clearly, similarly, yet dramatically, politically separate religious institutions. Anyway, so Blackthorne's interactions with Toranaga are closely based on accounts in the diaries of William Adams from 1564 to 1620. However, while Adams served in Tokugawa's army at Sekigahara, he did not become a retainer or a samurai until after the battle, and he was actually in the novel given his samurai title before that. So, history and the excitement of a novel are not always going to match up. And certainly when it was way before the person writing it. So history is always an interpretation whenever it's written. It's an interpretation by the victors, or it's an interpretation by someone who wants to share something about the events, or it's always through someone else's lens. It's never like this point blank factual experience. So always go into thinking about history through those lenses, because that's reality. There is no abject truth, because we are emotional creatures who have vastly different perspectives of the same event amongst the same people who are in those events, let alone separated by hundreds of years. So, and that's why I find it so fascinating that people think the Bible is true and accurate when it wasn't even codified until 350 years after any of the events would have taken place. But, it's the word of God, so it must be true. All right, so Adams never met Hosokawa Gracia, in contrast to Blackthorne's intimate relationship with Toda Mariko. And what are you going to do? We needed a love interest, and so James created one. The novel contains numerous Japanese language errors, as well as mistakenly depicting Japanese castles as having portcullis and 17th century samurai as using socket bayonets. Carrier pigeons used extensively by Toranaga were unknown in Japan at the time as well. So there are some genuine errors throughout this novel. So don't go into this, again, thinking that this is historically accurate. This is a adventure novel written by someone hundreds of years after the fact with their own perceptions and ideas. So always take novels with a grain of historical salt. Did that make sense? All right, so the premise is, for nearly 30 years, Japan has been fractured by dynastic clashes and was without a shogun, a central ruler. Japan was also interfered with militarily and politically by Catholic Portugal, in concert with Roman papacy and its Jesuits stationed in Japan and elsewhere in northern East Asia. The prime interests in Japan were to control trade with Europe and to propagate Roman Catholicism. Portugal had profited well as Japan's exclusive European trading partner for more than 50 years, but it was made uneasy with newly arrived Protestant Dutch threatening that exclusivity. And that is what this story is about. The fictional recounting of this story is really outlined through a surviving navigator of a Dutch ship crashing and his crew on a ship called the Erasmus. He crashed. They ended up on Japan, and they were immediately taken captive. They were marooned in Izu Harbor, and the daimyo of Izu was Lord Yabu, and he had taken them sort of as prisoner, and he was a sort of twisted fuck too. Like, he would boil people alive, watch people die in different ways, and then record it. It was visually shown in the series beautifully and terrifyingly, but it was written, in the novel in pretty good detail as well, with the screaming and how they had to deal with it, and it was awesome. It was pretty awesome. Anyway, he wanted to keep the ship a secret, but one of his lords, Toranaga, who was one of the chief, or he was one of the, uh, he was the president of the Council of Regents, is what I'm trying to get at. He was one of the major lords that, ostensibly, because there was no shogun, the previous shogun gave the right, of course, to his son, but his son was too young. And so there was a panel of regents that looked after the dynasty until their son could come of age. And of course, with that comes massive political infighting and maneuvering, and that is also a core aspect of this. So you have Christian denominations fighting for exclusivity with trade for Europe with Japan, and you have internal fighting within Japan's lords over who will actually control and how they're going to try to get out other lords so that they can seize control of Japan. Woof. So you can imagine the insanity that would ensue, and it does, and it's dope as hell. So I do think that the novel is, I think it's like two novels put into one, the version I read. I think originally it was released as two novels. I don't have anything to prove that, but I do believe I read it somewhere. I just can't find it anymore. So maybe I'm making it up. I don't know. In any case, it was long in the tooth. I don't think it needed to be that long. There was massive chunks of this novel devoted to Blackthorne's shock over Japanese sexual appetites and how they don't have shame, and how they have sex with men and women. And as long as it's sex, then who cares whether, as long as you're getting pleasure from it, who cares whether it's boys or girls? And he goes in this big diatribe about it's against God's will and men should not lie with men and all sorts of nonsense that it was going on so long, and it reprised itself so many different times, the whole conversation, that I feel like you could cut out 90% of that and you would save maybe 100 pages. I might be being a little exaggerating a little bit, a little hyperbolic, but it felt like a lot hyper focused on sexuality. And then just the idea of how women just gave themselves up and they had no real autonomy, and how people were expected to commit seppuku, which is suicide, by sticking a dagger in their stomach, ripping it open, having someone else be their second, and cutting off their head so they didn't have to suffer. But people would just beg to commit suicide constantly. How do you as a culture exist for any period of time and have any sort of cultural history and memory if 70% of the people are just killing themselves because they upset the master, or they made a slight mistake, or there was some, semblance of breach of honor? I mean, just so much nonsense. I just can't wrap my Western brain around it. And it really bothers me, because from a Western sense, I see suicide as a side effect of sheer depression and the feeling of loss and loneliness. And I've had friends commit suicide, and I don't like the idea that it is, instead of being something that is a side effect, it's actually a feature, that it's a desired outcome. And I can't rationalize it. And so that really bothers me. Now I have to just accept that, yes, this is a cultural thing that happened, and whatever, I move on. But while I was reading it, and all these people, for all these tiny little slights and ridiculous reasons, including some genuine reasons, being ordered to commit seppuku against their will, but they have to do it because their lord ordered it, or offering it up for making some imagined slight, it's just you have no appreciation of life. Is that what this is about? Because that's what it seems like. And so it takes away the celebration of their culture, of the richness of their appreciation of art and poetry and fashion and like everything. It takes all that and strips it away and says, well, none of that really matters. All that really matters is a semblance of honor. And if you upset anyone at any time, you could be ordered to kill yourself, and then your life is gone like that, and everything about you is gone. So if you're really talking about a culture that supposedly celebrates life, and yet in the next breath ends it for no fucking reason, then the first side of that coin means fuck all. That's how I see it. All right. So I fundamentally disagree with dynastic Japanese culture on so many levels. But then again, I'm not coming it from that time in that place. I'm coming it from a much later time in a Western, much more progressive mindset. So I have to just sort of wrap my brain around it. The story other than that, though, the political, the social, the religious infighting and maneuvering was very fascinating. And even when you got into like the war and the fighting and learning the culture, I mean, all of that was incredibly exciting and fascinating to discover as well. So I really, really did appreciate that. And I love the fact that, Blackthorne and having this wonderful relationship with the lady Mariko. Am I saying that right? Mariko. And they genuinely loved each other. And it was not hidden. And Mariko actually had a husband still, which kind of is a problem, when you think about it. But it was still brilliant narratively. And it was, I don't know, man. It was a trip to experience a completely different culture than my own through this pseudo historical context. And if you've ever been curious about dynastic Japanese samurai culture with a splash of ninjas thrown in there for fun and heavy political intrigue. I mean, I'm coming off of, I'm a fantasy reader and horror reader primarily, but when I read fantasy, I really like political fantasy like you get with George R.R. Martin's work. And so this is right up that alley, except it's more historical than fantasy, and which I also really, really appreciated it. So I would highly recommend it. My favorite part of this had to be the burgeoning relationship between the Lord Toranaga and Blackthorne, the Dutchman, who you couldn't be more different. I mean, these were two individuals that did not see the world the same way and did not experience the world in the same way. And yet there ended up being this connection between them that initially was because Toranaga needed him politically, and he was going to use him and did use him against his enemies and his knowledge against his enemies. But ultimately there ended up being almost, I'll say, as close to a friendship as people of those two dramatically different classes could have. And to watch that grow was beautiful. I mean, I don't know another word to describe it. It was really beautiful. And I really, really liked it. It was my most favorite part of this novel. My least favorite part was just, I already mentioned and sort of did a little diatribe on it, seppuku and women having zero fucking rights and just classes. How class-centric dynastic Japan is. It's garbage. I believe in merit being the reason you are elevated in life. And that's just not the way when it comes to a class-based society. And so, fuck that. That's kind of it. All right, so ultimately, I gave this 4 out of 5 evil eyes. I would have given it 5 evil eyes, and it probably does deserve it, but sweet fucking hell, it went on way too long. When you can look at a TV series, I think it's like 8 episodes or something like that. I can't remember exactly. And it was able to tell the same fundamental story in 8 hours compared to 45 hours of reading a novel. I mean, it's too long. It's too much. And so I guess those people that really like to tuck in to his tale and just like sort of be immersed in this new universe would love it. For me, it was a little bit long, but I did genuinely love the story. I loved the historical context, even though some of it was bullshit. And getting to dip my toe into dynastic Japan was a treat. It was a thrill. So definitely check it out if that's something that would interest you. It is worth the incredible amount of time that you're going to spend reading this novel. All right, that is it for my review. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to this episode, this review of James Clavell's Shōgun. As always, remember, like it or not, evil spelled backwards is live. So get out there, do not commit seppuku, no matter who tells you to do it, and be evil.